Close your eyes and journey back 40,000 years, to a world you would not recognize. The Earth is in the grip of an ice age. Glacial sheets, vast as continents, blanket the northern hemisphere, while colossal glaciers relentlessly carve new paths through ancient mountain ranges. In the fertile valleys nestled between the great rivers of Mesopotamia, early hominids roam the land. They are hunter-gatherers, armed with simple stone tools, oblivious to the concepts of cities, civilization, or the written word. They are, for all intents and purposes, alone on this planet. Or so we have always believed. But what if they weren't alone? What if, in that distant prehistoric dawn, visitors arrived from the heavens? Visitors with a desperate need, a profound hunger for something buried deep within the earth? What if those visitors needed gold? And what if, to acquire it, they created us, genetically engineering humanity from the clay of the earth and their own divine essence for one singular purpose, to mine that gold for them? Before we descend into this archaeological rabbit hole, before we examine the ancient clay tablets and the academic fury they have inspired, please ignite that like button. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. As always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Now settle in. Dim the lights if you can, and prepare for a journey through time that will challenge everything you thought you knew about human origins and our relationship with gold. That eternal, shimmering metal that has obsessed our species since before recorded history began. Our story starts not in a mine, not in Africa, not even on Earth, but within the pages of a book published in 1976 that would shake the foundations of how millions of people understood our past. The book was called The 12th Planet, and its author was a man named Zecharia Sitchin. Born in Baku, Azerbaijan in 1920, raised in Palestine, and educated in economics at the University of London, Sitchin was not an archaeologist, nor a trained linguist, nor a professional scholar of ancient Mesopotamia. He was a journalist, a businessman, an outsider looking in, but he taught himself to read Sumerian cuneiform, those wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay tablets over 4,000 years ago. And in those ancient inscriptions, Sitchin claimed to have found something that professional academics had either missed or, perhaps, deliberately ignored. He believed he had found the true history of humanity, written not in metaphor or religious allegory, but in literal, factual detail. The Sumerians, you see, are special. They emerged in southern Mesopotamia, in what is now modern-day Iraq, around 4500 BC. They are widely recognized by mainstream historians as the world's first true civilization. This is not a fringe theory. This is established fact. They invented the wheel, the plow, and the sailboat. They created cuneiform, one of the earliest systems of writing in human history. They developed sophisticated mathematics using a sexagesimal base 60 system that we still use today every time we look at a clock divided into 60 minutes and 60 seconds, or measure a circle with 360 degrees. They built massive, stepped pyramids called ziggurats, towering monuments of mud brick that dominated the flat Mesopotamian plains. They established complex city-states like Ur, Uruk, Eridu, and Nippur, each with its own patron deity, its own laws, and its own trade network stretching across the ancient Near East. But for Sitchin, the Sumerians were more than just an early civilization. They were the inheritors of extraterrestrial knowledge. According to his interpretation of their texts, the Sumerians themselves recorded that their civilization was not their own invention. It was a gift, a download of knowledge from beings they called the Anunnaki. Now, in mainstream Sumerian scholarship, this is a well-established historical fact. The Anunnaki were real to the ancient Mesopotamians. The word Anunnaki appears throughout Sumerian, Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian texts. Academic scholars generally translate it as princely offspring, or those of royal blood. The Anunnaki were the pantheon of major Sumerian deities, the children of An, the sky god, and Ki, the earth goddess. They were divine beings who controlled the fates of mortals, governed the natural world, and ruled from the heavens and the underworld. The earliest known uses of the term appear in texts from the reign of Gudea of Lagash, circa 2144 to 2124 BC, and the Third Dynasty of Ur. These texts describe the Anunnaki as powerful celestial beings, descendants of the primordial gods who decreed the destinies of humanity. In the poem Enki and the World Order, the Anunnaki do homage to Enki, the god of water and wisdom, and take up their dwellings among the people of Sumer. Virtually every major deity in the Sumerian pantheon was considered part of the Anunnaki. This included Enlil, the god of wind and storms, who held supreme authority on earth; Enki, also called Ea in Akkadian, the god of the freshwater abyss, wisdom, and creation; Ninhursag, the mother goddess; Inanna, later known as Ishtar, the goddess of love and war; Utu, the sun god; and Nana, the moon god. These were the Anunnaki, the great gods, the ones who shaped the cosmos and controlled human destiny. But Sitchin saw something different in those clay tablets. He claimed that Anunnaki actually meant those who from heaven to earth came. Not gods in a spiritual sense, but physical, extraterrestrial beings, visitors, astronauts from another world. And this is where the academic community draws a very firm line. Dr. Michael Heiser, who held a PhD in Hebrew Bible and ancient Semitic languages from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, devoted significant effort to demonstrating that Sitchin's translations were fundamentally flawed. Heiser and countless other Sumerologists, Assyriologists, and linguists have stated unequivocally that Sitchin's translation of Anunnaki as those who from heaven came is not supported by any linguistic evidence. It is, they argue, either a mistranslation or a complete fabrication. The ancient Mesopotamians themselves left us bilingual dictionaries. We have them. They have been published since the mid-19th century. In those dictionaries, compiled by the Sumerians and Babylonians themselves, the word Sitchin claimed meant rocket ships or space travelers, simply do not have those meanings. The word Shem, for example, which Sitchin translated as rocket ship or celestial vehicle, actually means name or reputation in both Sumerian and Hebrew. The Anunnaki weren't riding in Shems to travel between worlds. They were concerned with making a Shem for themselves, with establishing their reputation, their legacy. It's the difference between saying someone has launched a rocket and saying someone has made a name for themselves. Scholars point out that to accept Sitchin's interpretations, you must reject the translations and definitions left to us by the ancient scribes who actually spoke these languages. You must believe Sitchin over the Sumerians themselves. And yet, despite this near-universal academic rejection, Sitchin's theories have flourished. His books have sold millions of copies worldwide, translated into more than 25 languages. Why? Because he offered something that dry academic scholarship often cannot provide. A complete, dramatic, emotionally satisfying explanation for the deepest mysteries of human existence. Where did we come from? According to Sitchin, we were created by the Anunnaki approximately 300,000 years ago through genetic engineering. Why are we here? To serve as a labor force, specifically to mine gold. Are we alone in the universe? No. Our creators are still out there, and they may one day return. And that brings us to the heart of the theory. The gold. Because according to Sitchin's interpretation of Sumerian texts, gold wasn't just valuable to the Anunnaki for ornamental reasons, for jewelry, crowns, or decorating temples. For them, gold was survival. Their entire civilization depended on it. Sitchin claimed that the Anunnaki came from a planet he called Nibiru, which he identified as a 12th member of our solar system, counting the sun, moon, and the 9 known planets. He asserted that Nibiru travels on a vast, highly elliptical orbit that takes 3,600 Earth years to complete. For most of that immense cycle, Nibiru is lost in the darkness of deep space, far beyond Pluto. But every 3,600 years, its orbit brings it swinging back through the inner solar system. The problem facing the Anunnaki, according to Sitchin, was atmospheric. Their planet's atmosphere was failing, eroding away into space. Without intervention, their world would become uninhabitable. Their scientists determined that the only way to save their civilization was to suspend vast quantities of finely ground gold particles in their upper atmosphere. This gold shield would act as a protective layer, reflecting harmful solar radiation, trapping heat, and stabilizing their climate. It was the most ambitious geoengineering project imaginable, and it required massive amounts of gold, more gold than existed on Nibiru itself. So they looked outward. They surveyed the solar system and found Earth, a water-rich planet teeming with life, its crust loaded with easily accessible gold deposits. It was perfect, and so, approximately 450,000 years ago, the first expedition arrived. The academic response to this part of the theory is swift and uncompromising. There is no planet Nibiru. Dr. Michael Heiser analyzed every known cuneiform text that mentions the word Nibiru and found that it refers to exactly 4 things in Mesopotamian astronomy. The planet Jupiter, most commonly, the planet Mercury, occasionally, the god Marduk, and a star, specifically as a reference to celestial crossing points. Never, in any ancient text, does Nibiru refer to a planet beyond Pluto. Never does it describe a world on a 3,600-year elliptical orbit. The Sumerians, by their own astronomical records, knew of only 5 planets: Venus, Jupiter, Mars, Saturn, and Mercury, plus the sun and moon, which they also counted as celestial bodies. Their star catalogs, their astronomical texts, their mathematical tablets. All of this has been decoded and translated. The total count of celestial bodies they observed was 7, not 12. Modern astronomy also weighs in. NASA has stated clearly that there is no evidence for a massive planet beyond Neptune on the kind of orbit Sitchin described. Such an object would create easily detectable gravitational perturbations in the orbits of the known planets. We've sent probes to the outer solar system. We've mapped the heavens with infrared telescopes specifically designed to detect distant, cold objects. If Nibiru existed as Sitchin described, we would have found it by now. But the absence of planet Nibiru doesn't mean the absence of gold. Gold is very, very real, and the ancient world's obsession with it is undeniable. So, let's examine what we actually know about gold in the ancient world, starting with the Sumerians themselves. The Sumerians did not have natural gold deposits in Mesopotamia. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, that fertile crescent where their civilization flourished, has no gold-bearing rock formations. Every ounce of gold the Sumerians possessed had to be imported through trade networks that stretched across the ancient Near East. Sumerian texts reference gold coming from several locations. A place called Arata, possibly located in what is now Iran, the land of Meluha, likely the Indus Valley civilization, mountains near modern-day Turkey, and perhaps even mythical locations whose exact identity we've lost to time. Archaeological evidence from the Royal Cemetery at UR, excavated in the 1920s by Sir Leonard Woolley, revealed stunning quantities of gold artifacts. Elaborate headdresses, jewelry, ceremonial daggers, cups, bowls, and intricate filigree work demonstrating extraordinary craftsmanship. These objects date to approximately 2600 BC, the height of early Sumerian civilization. But here's what's crucial to understand. The Sumerians used gold almost exclusively for religious and elite purposes. It adorned temples. It decorated the tombs of kings and queens. It was fashioned into offerings for the gods. It was not, however, notably used as currency in the way later civilizations would use gold coins. To the Sumerians, gold represented prestige, divine connection, and immortality. It was the metal of the gods themselves. The Sumerian texts make this clear. Gold belonged in the treasuries of temples, in the hands of rulers, and in the graves of those being prepared for the afterlife. This raises an interesting question. If gold was so precious, so closely associated with divine power, where did that association come from? Mainstream archaeology provides a straightforward answer. Gold is rare, beautiful, doesn't corrode, and is easily worked. These practical qualities made it naturally valuable for expressing wealth and power. But the ancient astronaut theory offers a more provocative explanation. What if the reason gold was associated with the gods is because the gods literally demanded it? What if the oldest Sumerian temples weren't just places of worship, but collection points, warehouses where tribute gold was gathered before being transported, somehow off-world? Now, Sitchin's theory specifically claimed that the primary gold mining operations weren't in Mesopotamia at all. They were in Africa, southeastern Africa to be precise. And this is where things get genuinely interesting, because there is actual archaeological evidence of ancient mining in southern Africa that dates back tens of thousands of years. The mainstream dating and the fringe dating diverge wildly, but the mining itself is real. In South Africa, particularly in the areas that would later become famous for the Witwatersrand gold fields and the Johannesburg gold rush of the 1880s, there is extensive evidence of prehistoric mining activity. Archaeologists have documented thousands of ancient mine shafts, some dating back to the Iron Age, around 400 AD. Others potentially much older. These weren't simple surface gatherings. These were deep mining operations, with tunnels extending meters into the earth, requiring organized labor and a sophisticated knowledge of geology. In Eswatini, formerly Swaziland, there's a site called Ngwenya Mine, which has been called the world's oldest mine. Radiocarbon dating of charcoal and stone tools found there has yielded dates of 41,000 to 43,000 years ago. Now, mainstream archaeologists are clear about what was being mined there at that time. Not gold. The mine at Ngwenya was primarily for extracting red ochre, a form of iron oxide, and specularite, a glittery form of hematite, used for cosmetics and ritualistic purposes. These were mined by Middle Stone Age peoples, the ancestors of the modern San Bushmen, who used the pigments for rock paintings and body decoration. The systematic mining of gold in southern Africa, according to mainstream archaeology, began much later, around the 10th to 13th centuries AD, with the kingdom of Mapungubwe and, later, the civilization of Great Zimbabwe. These African kingdoms definitely mined gold and traded it extensively along the Indian Ocean trade routes with Arab merchants, eventually reaching as far as China and Persia. But here is where the fringe theories gain their foothold. Researchers like Michael Tellinger have claimed to have found evidence of much older mining operations in South Africa. Not for ochre, but specifically for gold. Tellinger points to hundreds of thousands of stone circle ruins scattered across southern Africa, ancient agricultural terraces, complex road systems, and what he interprets as evidence of a sophisticated civilization that existed 200,000 years ago or more. Mainstream archaeology does not support a 200,000-year-old advanced civilization in Africa. The evidence Tellinger presents, the stone circles and ruins, are generally dated by professional archaeologists to the last 1,000 to 2,000 years, associated with Bantu-speaking peoples who moved into the region relatively recently in historical terms. But the claim persists because it's tantalizing. The idea that the deepest, richest gold deposits on Earth, the very gold fields that would make South Africa one of the wealthiest nations in Africa during the colonial period, were also the site of the Anunnaki's mining operations 450,000 years ago is narratively perfect. It's almost too perfect. And that's exactly what makes it suspect to scholars, because Sitchin's theory appears to reverse engineer the evidence. He starts with his conclusion that the Anunnaki mined gold in Africa, then finds any and all evidence that could possibly support that conclusion, while ignoring the vast body of contradictory evidence. This is known as confirmation bias, and it's the opposite of how good scholarship works. But let's return to the Sumerian texts themselves, because there is a text, a very important text, that describes almost exactly what Sitchin claimed: the creation of humanity as a labor force to relieve the gods of their burdensome work. That text is called the Atrahasis Epic, and it's one of the most complete accounts of creation and flood mythology from ancient Mesopotamia. The Atrahasis Epic dates to approximately 1700 BC, though it draws on much older Sumerian traditions. The most complete version was written during the reign of King Emisaduqa of Babylon. And yes, it absolutely describes the creation of humans for labor. But let's be very precise about what it actually says. The epic begins not with humanity, but with the gods themselves engaged in backbreaking work. The text states, "When the gods were man, they did forced labor, they bore drudgery. Great indeed was the drudgery of the gods." The text describes how the 7 great Anunnaki gods were burdening the Igigi gods, a group of lesser deities, with this forced labor. These junior gods were assigned the task of digging out the watercourses, dredging the canals that would irrigate Mesopotamia, excavating the very rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates. This is explicitly stated. The Igigi gods dug the Tigris River and the Euphrates thereafter. They toiled for 40 years, according to some versions, 3,600 years according to others. They dug the canals, cleared the channels, and performed the exhausting, grinding labor that would transform the raw land into an agricultural paradise. But the Igigi gods eventually had enough. They burned their tools and marched on the house of Enlil, the chief god and executive authority of the divine council. They surrounded his temple in the middle of the night and refused to work any longer. It was a divine labor strike. Enlil was furious. He wanted to punish the rebels to make an example of the ringleaders. But Enki, his brother, the god of wisdom and water, proposed a different solution. Why punish the workers, Enki argued, when we could simply create replacements? Let us make a new being, he suggested, a Lulu, a primitive worker, fashioned specifically to bear the workload. Let this being assume the drudgery of the gods. The divine council agreed. But how would this new creature be made? Here the text becomes fascinatingly specific, almost clinical in its description. Enki called upon Ninhursag, also called Beliali or Mami, depending on the text, the birth goddess, the mother of all. Together, they would perform an act of creation through what can only be described as a form of biotechnology. First, they needed raw material, clay from the earth. Not just any clay, but clay specifically from the Abzu, Enki's freshwater domain deep beneath the ground. This was the base, the hardware. But clay alone wouldn't suffice. The new creature needed something more. It needed intelligence, consciousness, a ghost in the machine. For this, a sacrifice was required. A god had to die. The text names him Geshtu-i, a deity described as having intelligence. In a solemn ritual, Geshtu-i was slain, and his blood and flesh, his divine essence, was mixed with the clay. The mother goddess Ninhursag took this potent mixture and divided it into 14 portions, 7 for males and 7 for females. These portions were then implanted into the wombs of 14 birth goddesses who served as surrogate mothers. After a specified gestation period, the first humans were born. The text records Ninhursag's triumphant proclamation, "I have created. My hands have made it." This is not, as Sitchin claimed, a description of humans being created specifically to mine gold. The Atrahasis epic never mentions gold. Not once. The entire purpose, as explicitly stated in the text, was to relieve the gods of agricultural labor, to dig irrigation canals, to maintain the rivers, to work the fields, to produce food. The creation of humanity in the Mesopotamian worldview was fundamentally about agriculture, about transforming the wild landscape into civilization. But Sitchin read between the lines. He argued that the texts had been edited, sanitized, that references to mining had been lost or deliberately obscured over thousands of years of copying and recopying. He pointed to the fact that gold mining requires the same kind of brutal physical labor. Digging, excavating, working deep underground in dangerous conditions. If the Anunnaki needed workers for one kind of digging, why not all kinds? The speculative, but it's not entirely without logic. However, the mainstream academic consensus holds that the Atrahasis epic, like all Mesopotamian creation myths, is precisely what it appears to be, a theological and political text designed to explain the relationship between gods and humanity. It justifies the social order where kings ruled as representatives of the gods and where the common people labored to support the temples and palaces. It provides an origin story for the Sumerian understanding of their place in the cosmos. The story answers fundamental questions. Why do humans have to work so hard? Because we were literally created for labor. Why do we die? Because we are not fully divine. Why do bad things happen? Because the gods can be capricious, angry, even regretful. The text goes on to describe how humanity multiplied across the earth. We were successful, too successful. Our population exploded and we became noisy. This might sound absurd, but it is explicitly stated in the text. The country was as noisy as a bellowing bull. The god grew restless at their racket. Enlil had to listen to their noise. I am losing sleep over their racket. So Enlil decided to reduce the human population. First, he sent a plague. But Enki warned his faithful human servant, Atrahasis, who organized prayers and offerings to the plague god, Namtar, and the plague was lifted. Then Enlil sent a drought and famine. Again, Enki intervened and humanity survived. Finally, Enlil decided on total annihilation. He would send a great flood to wipe out humanity entirely. And this is where the Atrahasis epic becomes the clear prototype for the later biblical story of Noah and the Arkansas Enki, bound by an oath not to directly warn any human of the coming flood, found a loophole. He went to Atrahasis's reed hut and spoke not to the man, but to the wall. Wall, listen to me, he said. Reed wall, pay attention to all my words. Tear down your house and build a boat. Forsake possessions and save life. On the other side of the wall, Atrahasis heard and understood the cryptic command. He set to work, constructing a massive boat and meticulously sealing its hull with bitumen. He then loaded it with his family, skilled craftsmen, and what the text calls the seed of all living things, a collection of representative animals and likely a stockpile of seeds for future planting. When the deluge came, its ferocity was so terrifying that even the gods themselves were gripped by fear. The mother goddess, Ninhursag, wept for the destruction of humanity. The other deities cowered like beaten dogs in the highest heaven. Hungry and thirsty, they lamented, for there were no longer any humans to make them offerings. After 7 days and 7 nights of relentless storm, the floodwaters finally began to subside. Atrahasis, in a sequence that would later be echoed in the story of Noah, released birds to find dry land. When the waters had fully receded, he made a sacrifice to the heavens. The starving gods, who had been without sustenance for a week, gathered like flies around the sweet-smelling smoke of the offering. Enlil was furious that any human had survived, but Enki skillfully convinced him that total extermination was a poor and short-sighted policy. Instead, they devised new, more subtle measures for population control. From that point forward, the gods decreed that humanity would be afflicted with infertility, infant mortality, and enforced celibacy. 1/3 of all women would not successfully bear children. Malevolent demons would snatch infants from their mothers' laps. And a portion of women would become priestesses, consecrated to the gods and forbidden to have children at all. This, they reasoned, was how the noise of humanity would be kept at a manageable level. Now, this is the very text that modern authors like Sitchin point to as definitive proof of ancient astronaut intervention. And to be fair, if you strip away the theological interpretation and read it as a literal historical account, it does sound remarkably like a story of genetic engineering. The mixing of a divine essence, meaning superior DNA, with earthly clay, meaning native hominids, using birth goddesses as surrogates to create a new hybrid species. But this brings us to the crucial question. Is that what the text is actually saying? Or is that simply what our modern, technologically minded culture wants to hear? Mainstream scholars are unanimous in their assessment. These are religious texts, foundation myths. They employ metaphor, symbolism, and anthropomorphic language to explain the origins of the world and the human condition. When the text says a god was slain and his blood mixed with clay, it's describing a ritualistic infusion of divine life force into inert matter, not a laboratory procedure involving test tubes and DNA sequencers. The gods of Mesopotamian mythology were not physical, biological beings from another planet. They were numinous forces, existing in the heavens and the underworld, who manifested their power through statues and temples and communicated through dreams, omens, and the movements of the stars. However, there is an interesting middle ground that's worth exploring. What if these texts are not literal history, but are instead the garbled and distorted memories of real events, passed down through thousands of years of oral tradition? The events might not involve aliens, but something else entirely. Some researchers have proposed that the Anunnaki myths might preserve a cultural memory of an earlier, more advanced human civilization that was wiped out by a cataclysm or sudden climate change. This could possibly refer to the massive global flooding that occurred when Ice Age glaciers melted rapidly around 11,700 years ago, at the end of the Younger Dryas period. In this interpretation, the gods were not extraterrestrials, but were the human survivors of that lost civilization. Possessing advanced knowledge of agriculture, engineering, and astronomy, they would have appeared godlike to the less developed, post-cataclysm populations they encountered. It's plausible these survivors put the local populations to work on massive agricultural and construction projects, building sophisticated irrigation systems, raising the world's first cities, and teaching them mathematics and astronomy. Over millennia, the story would have evolved through retelling. The advanced humans became mythologized as gods. Their technology became indistinguishable from magic. Their instructions became divine commandments. Their knowledge of metallurgy and mining became a divine gift or a divine demand. While this idea is still speculative, it provides a fascinating alternative that doesn't require us to believe in beings from another planet. It simply requires us to accept that human history might be far more complex and more cyclical than the linear progression we've been taught. There's another piece of evidence that complicates the entire picture. The sheer ubiquity of gold in ancient religious contexts, found across disparate cultures that had no contact with each other. The Sumerians weren't alone in their reverence for gold. The ancient Egyptians built their entire theology of the afterlife around it. The flesh of their gods was said to be made of pure gold, and pharaohs were entombed in golden sarcophagi to facilitate their own transformation into deities. The solid gold funerary mask of Tutankhamun is perhaps the most famous artifact from the ancient world, a testament to this belief. For the Egyptians, gold wasn't just valuable. It was the substance of divinity itself. In Mesoamerica, the Aztecs and Incas treasured gold for similar spiritual reasons. They didn't value it primarily for economic exchange. They valued it because it was the sweat of the sun, a sacred material imbued with transformative, life-giving properties. The Spanish conquistadors were baffled by this perspective. They craved gold for its monetary value to fund their empires. The indigenous peoples revered it for its spiritual power. In India, gold has been held sacred for thousands of years, associated with purity, prosperity, and the divine feminine. Hindu temples are filled with golden statues and offerings. In ancient China, alchemists sought to create gold not for wealth, but because they believed it was an incorruptible metal that could grant immortality, a substance that bridged the earthly and the divine. What all these independent cultures share is a deep, almost inexplicable reverence for this one specific metal above all others. Is this simply because gold is rare, shiny, and doesn't rust? Or is there something deeper at play, some universal human recognition that this metal is uniquely special? The ancient astronaut theory provides a clear answer. Yes, it's deeper. We were either genetically or culturally programmed to value gold because our creators needed it. We were taught to seek it, treasure it, and even fight over it because doing so fulfilled the Anunnaki's original purpose for creating us. This is perhaps the most seductive part of the theory, as it offers a single, unified explanation for a widespread and universal human behavior. But the mainstream explanation is equally powerful, if less dramatic. Gold is, objectively, a special material. It is one of the least reactive metals, meaning it doesn't tarnish or corrode, giving it a sense of permanence and eternity. It is incredibly malleable, allowing it to be worked into intricate and beautiful forms even with primitive tools. It is rare enough to be precious, but not so rare that it's impossible to find. And it catches the light, glowing with a warmth that few other materials can replicate. These practical and aesthetic properties make it naturally suited for symbolizing permanence, purity, and divine perfection. And yet, there's still that nagging question. If gold's value is entirely practical and aesthetic, why did so many ancient civilizations, without any contact, independently decide that this specific metal belonged to the gods? Let's examine one more angle: the immense physical difficulty of obtaining gold. Because whether the Anunnaki existed or not, one thing is undeniably true. Mining gold has always been brutal, dangerous work. In the ancient world, before the advent of modern machinery, it was even more so. Miners toiled in narrow, unstable tunnels, breathing in toxic dust that ravaged their lungs. They faced the constant threat of cave-ins and underground flooding. They often used a technique called fire setting, where they would heat a rock face with a massive fire and then rapidly cool it with water, causing it to fracture. This process released choking smoke and poisonous fumes into the unventilated shafts. In ancient Egypt, the gold mines in the Nubian desert were so horrific that the labor was performed almost exclusively by slaves and prisoners of war, people who were literally worked to death in the blistering desert heat. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BC, visited these mines and described them as places of unimaginable suffering, where human beings were subjected to the worst of deaths. This pattern continued into the modern era. When European colonizers discovered the Witwatersrand gold deposits in South Africa in the 1880s, they created a system of migrant labor that subjected men from across the region to brutal, exploitative conditions. The Johannesburg gold mines became legendary for their high death tolls. Even today, with advanced safety equipment and regulations, gold mining remains one of the most dangerous occupations in the world. So this raises a critical question. If ancient humans valued gold so highly merely for its beauty and symbolic properties, why did they force other humans into such appalling conditions to extract it? Why not just content themselves with surface gold, the nuggets found in riverbeds and easily accessible deposits? Why did they feel compelled to dig deeper and deeper, sometimes extending mines hundreds of feet underground, risking everything for just a little more of the yellow metal? The practical answer is straightforward. The easy gold ran out. As societies grew and gold became inextricably linked with royal and religious power, demand outstripped the surface supply. Kings and priests needed ever-increasing quantities to maintain their status, to furnish their temples, and to be buried with them for the afterlife. Competition for this ultimate symbol of legitimacy drove the mining operations ever deeper into the earth. But the ancient astronaut theory offers a more provocative answer. What if the mines went so deep because the Anunnaki's demand was insatiable? What if the brutal conditions and the utter expendability of human life in the pursuit of gold were a direct continuation of our original programming? We were created to be a slave species of miners. The fact that we continue to engage in this perilous work, even at a tremendous human cost, is evidence that we are still fulfilling that ancient function, long after our supposed creators have departed. This is where the theory becomes almost perfectly unfalsifiable, because it explains away both the evidence and the lack of it. Why don't we find any ancient high-tech mining equipment? Because the Anunnaki took it with them when they left. Why don't the Sumerian texts explicitly state that gold was being mined for aliens? Because those specific references were deliberately removed, lost over time, or exist in tablets that have not yet been discovered. Why do mainstream academics overwhelmingly reject the theory? Because they are either ignorant of the truth or are part of a massive, coordinated cover-up. This is the classic hallmark of a conspiracy theory. Every piece of contradictory evidence is twisted to become proof of the conspiracy itself. And yet, even the most skeptical observer must admit there are genuinely puzzling questions. The sophistication of Sumerian civilization, appearing seemingly out of nowhere in the archaeological record around 3500 BC, is a true enigma. They possessed advanced writing, mathematics, astronomy, complex social organization, and monumental architecture, all of which emerged within a relatively short span of time. Mainstream archaeology explains this as the culmination of thousands of years of gradual development, much of which took place in small agricultural villages that left behind little archaeological trace. But the ancient astronaut theorists push back. Where is the evidence of that gradual development? Why don't we find a proto-writing that is halfway between simple pictographs and complex cuneiform? Why don't we see a clear progression of primitive ziggurats that were obviously practice runs before they built the massive, mathematically precise structures? The absence of evidence, they argue, is evidence that the knowledge came from an external source, fully formed, downloaded into the human mind. But as the famous saying goes, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because we haven't yet found every single step of the developmental process doesn't mean those steps didn't exist. Archaeological evidence is fragmentary by its very nature, especially from periods like the 4th and 5th millennia BC, when populations were smaller and settlements were often built from perishable materials like mudbrick and reeds. The fact remains that we do see a gradual progression if we look carefully enough. The earliest forms of proto-writing in Mesopotamia appear around 3400 BC as simple accounting tokens and pictographs. Over many centuries, these symbols evolved into the sophisticated cuneiform system. The earliest temple platforms were much smaller and cruder than the later massive ziggurats. We can, in fact, trace the architectural development from simple raised platforms to multi-tiered pyramids. So, the academic consensus stands firm. The Sumerians were a brilliant and innovative people who built their own civilization through ingenuity, hard work, and the patient accumulation of knowledge over many generations. They needed no extraterrestrial intervention. Their obsession with gold was rooted in their own culture and religion, not as a service to alien masters. The Atrahasis epic is a powerful creation myth, not a genetic engineering manual. And Zechariah Sitchin was a talented writer with a vivid imagination who either profoundly misunderstood or deliberately misrepresented the ancient texts in order to sell books. But here's what is truly fascinating. The comprehensive academic takedown of Sitchin's theories has done almost nothing to diminish their popular influence. If anything, the more scholars insist the theory is wrong, the more convinced some people become that there must be a cover-up. Why would the academic establishment be so defensive? The argument goes, unless they had something to hide. This is the paradox of fringe theories in the internet age. They thrive on opposition. They feed on official skepticism. Every scholarly debunking is reframed as evidence of suppression. Every expert dismissal is interpreted as proof of a rigid, closed-minded dogma. At its core, the ancient astronaut theory taps into something deep within the human psyche. The profound feeling that we are not alone in the universe, the desire to believe that our existence has a grander purpose and design, and the hope that someone, somewhere, knows the answers to life's biggest questions. Perhaps most powerfully, it offers a single, unified narrative that seems to make sense of disparate and confusing pieces of evidence. Why did ancient civilizations build massive stone structures that seem impossibly difficult to construct with primitive tools? Alien guidance. Why do ancient texts from around the world describe gods descending from the sky in fiery chariots? They were witnessing spacecraft. Why does humanity have such a deep, cross-cultural obsession with gold? We were programmed to mine it for our creators. It's an elegant narrative. Simple. And, according to every credible expert in every relevant field, it's almost certainly wrong. But it remains incredibly compelling. Let's examine one final piece of the puzzle. The question of motivation and scale. If the Anunnaki truly existed, if they really created us to mine gold for them, and if their entire civilization's survival depended on extracting Earth's gold reserves to save their dying planet, where is all that gold now? Think about this carefully. Sitchin's timeline claims this massive mining operation began 450,000 years ago and continued for hundreds of thousands of years. Even with primitive human labor, working at a pace we would consider agonizingly slow, that is an almost incomprehensible amount of time. How much gold could have been extracted over 400,000 years? For perspective, the Witwatersrand Basin in South Africa, the richest gold field ever discovered on Earth, has produced more than 1.5 billion troy ounces of gold, about 50,000 metric tons, since modern industrial mining began there in the late 1800s. And that's just in the last 140 years using industrial methods. Now, imagine 400,000 years of continuous mining across the globe. Even at a tiny fraction of the modern industrial rate, the amount of gold removed from the Earth would be absolutely staggering. So where did it all go? If it was shipped off-world to their home planet, Nibiru, there should be some kind of archaeological evidence of the industrial-scale logistics involved. Colossal smelting facilities, refineries, secure storage depots, launch facilities, something. The response from ancient astronaut theorists is that all such evidence was deliberately removed when the Anunnaki left, or that it exists but is being suppressed by world governments who don't want us to know the truth. But here is the critical flaw in that argument. Gold is basically indestructible. It doesn't rust, decay, or break down. If massive, planetary-scale quantities of gold were extracted and processed in ancient times, there would be unavoidable traces left behind. We would find microscopic gold dust layered in ancient sediments, gold residue in soil samples near supposed mining sites, and elevated gold concentrations in certain geological areas indicating industrial-scale processing. We simply do not find that evidence. What we do find tells a very different story. The total amount of gold ever mined by humans throughout all of recorded history is estimated to be around 190,000 metric tons. To make that number easier to grasp, all the gold ever mined would fit into a single cube measuring about 21 meters or 69 feet on each side. That's it. Every wedding ring, every gold coin, every bar in Fort Knox, and every priceless ancient treasure could fit inside a structure smaller than a typical 6-story building. This is not the output of a 400,000-year industrial mining operation run by an advanced alien civilization desperate to save its planet. This is the output of human civilization gradually discovering, valuing, and extracting a rare and beautiful metal over the course of several thousand years. Now, proponents of the theory might argue that we're looking at it wrong. Maybe the Anunnaki weren't interested in all gold, but only isotopically pure gold or gold with other specific properties. Maybe they used advanced methods of extraction that left no trace. Maybe. And this is the fundamental problem with the theory. It is built entirely on a foundation of maybes. It requires us to accept an extraordinary claim that we were created by aliens to mine gold, despite the complete and total absence of any extraordinary evidence to support it. What we do have is ordinary evidence for an ordinary, if still remarkable, story. Humans evolved naturally on Earth through evolutionary processes that took millions of years. We discovered gold, recognized its unique and useful properties, and began to value it culturally and economically. We developed mining techniques over time, starting with simple surface collection and gradually inventing the technology to mine deeper into the earth. We created myths and religions that incorporated gold as a powerful symbol of the divine because its physical properties, its permanence and radiant beauty, made it uniquely suitable for that role. Sumerian civilization emerged through the gradual accumulation of agricultural surplus, social organization, and technological innovation in a region of the world uniquely suited for the development of early civilization. They wrote down their religious beliefs, their understanding of the cosmos, and their relationship with their gods in texts that are exactly what they appear to be, religious and mythological narratives, written using the language and concepts available to Bronze Age Mesopotamian scribes. There is no hidden alien message in those ancient texts. There is no suppressed archaeological evidence. There is no grand cover-up. There is only human history, which is, in itself, strange and surprising enough without needing to invent extraterrestrial intervention. But we must acknowledge the persistent appeal of the theory, because it matters that millions of people find Sitchin's narrative more satisfying than the mainstream academic account. What does that tell us about ourselves? Perhaps it tells us that the standard, scientific story of human history feels incomplete or emotionally empty to many people. The idea that we are just cosmic accidents, biological machines produced by the blind forces of evolution, living on an insignificant rock that orbits an average star in an unremarkable galaxy, can be an existentially lonely thought. The ancient astronaut theory offers an antidote to that loneliness. It offers purpose, design, and cosmic significance. In this story, we matter because we were created for a reason. We have value because we were designed. We are connected to something larger than ourselves, even if that something is a race of beings who initially made us to dig holes in the ground. Still a connection. Still a form of meaning. And that is a powerful draw. The theory also appeals to a growing anti-establishment sentiment. It positions believers as enlightened truth seekers, standing bravely against a dogmatic academic and governmental elite. You can see the truth that the so-called experts are trying to hide, while the masses remain blind. That's an intoxicating feeling. But here's what gets lost in all of this. The actual evidence-based human story is, in its own right, utterly extraordinary. We did evolve from earlier hominids, but that process produced a species capable of symbolic thought, language, art, music, mathematics, and science. We did develop civilization in Mesopotamia, but we did it through our own collective effort, our ingenuity, and the careful transmission of knowledge across generations. We did value gold, but we also valued copper, silver, lapis lazuli, obsidian, and countless other materials, each playing a vital role in the complex tapestry of ancient culture. We did build massive, awe-inspiring structures, but we did it by organizing thousands of workers, developing sophisticated engineering techniques through trial and error, and dedicating our resources to a common goal over decades or even centuries. We created writing not because aliens taught us, but because we had a practical need to keep track of trade and taxes, and a spiritual need to tell our stories. The actual story of how a species of African apes became the dominant force on this planet, built cities, split the atom, and sent probes to the edge of the solar system, all in the geological blink of an eye, is staggering. We don't need aliens to make our story interesting. And that brings us back, finally, to gold. That eternal, incorruptible metal. Gold was one of the very first metals humans learned to work with, possibly as early as 6000 BC, and certainly by 4000 BC in the ancient Near East. It has been an integral part of human culture ever since. We have fought wars over it, built empires on it, and used it as money, jewelry, and sacred objects. We have never stopped mining it. Even today, with all our modern priorities, we still extract thousands of tons of gold from the earth every single year. Why? Not because the Anunnaki programmed us to, but because gold has enduring practical and cultural uses. It's an excellent electrical conductor used in nearly all sophisticated electronics. It's chemically stable and non-toxic, making it invaluable in medicine and dentistry. And yes, it is still beautiful, still rare, and still a powerful symbol of wealth and permanence. Our relationship with gold is complex, but it is an entirely human one. We made gold valuable simply because we, as a species, decided it was. And that collective decision has had enormous, world-shaping consequences. The Spanish conquest of the Americas was driven in large part by a frenzied lust for gold. The California gold rush of 1849 transformed the American West. The discovery of gold in South Africa drove colonization and shaped the entire tragic history of that region. Gold has caused as much suffering as it has created splendor. But that is a human story, not an alien one. So where does all of this leave us? We are left with the Sumerian tablets, the persistent ancient astronaut theories, the exasperated academic consensus, and the enduring mystery of why this theory simply won't die, no matter how thoroughly it is debunked. Perhaps the answer is that we've been asking the wrong question all along. The question isn't whether the Anunnaki came to Earth to mine gold. The evidence overwhelmingly says they didn't, primarily because they didn't exist as physical beings. The Anunnaki were gods within the Mesopotamian religious tradition, nothing more and nothing less. The real question is why we want to believe they did. What void does this theory fill? What deep-seated need does it satisfy that the actual, evidence-based story of human origins does not? Maybe it's comfort. Maybe it's a sense of wonder. Maybe it's the quiet hope that somewhere out there in this vast, silent universe, we have family, even if that family initially saw us as nothing more than useful tools. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe, at the end of the day, we just love a good story. And the ancient astronaut theory is undeniably a very good story. It has everything. Ancient mysteries, government cover-ups, divine beings who turn out to be aliens, genetic engineering, planetary catastrophes, and lost civilizations. It is science fiction masquerading as hidden history. And in an age where the line between fact and fiction often feels blurry, where we can access infinite information but struggle to know what is true, theories like this are bound to thrive. What we can say with certainty is this: the Sumerians were real. Their civilization was extraordinary. Their texts survive, and they can be translated reliably by experts who have dedicated their lives to understanding these ancient languages. Those texts describe the Anunnaki as gods, powerful, capricious beings who shaped the world and controlled human destiny through divine decree. Gold was immensely valued in the ancient world, mined at great human cost, and associated with the divine across many cultures. There is clear archaeological evidence of ancient mining in many parts of the world, including Africa. None of this evidence points to extraterrestrial intervention, but all of it points to something equally remarkable: the story of human beings who, working with the materials and knowledge available to them, built civilizations, developed technologies, and created timeless works of art and literature. They left us literature that still moves us thousands of years later, and a permanent record of their existence, meticulously carved in stone and painstakingly pressed into clay. That record is worth studying, worth preserving, and worth understanding entirely on its own terms. It should not be seen as a collection of encoded messages from alien beings, but as the authentic voice of our ancestors, speaking to us across the millennia, telling us who they were, what they believed, and how they understood their place in the cosmos. The Anunnaki didn't forge humanity into a race of gold miners. Rather, our ancestors forged the very idea of the Anunnaki to help them navigate a confusing and dangerous world. They created them to instill hope that powerful beings were watching over them, and to provide an explanation for why life was so brutally hard, why they had to toil in the fields, dig the canals, and build the temples under a punishing sun. In a way, this human-centric explanation is far more profound than the alien theory because it reveals something fundamental about our own nature. When faced with suffering and uncertainty, we create meaning. We tell stories. We look to the heavens for answers. And sometimes we find those answers not because they are objectively true, but because they give us the strength to survive, to endure, and to keep building even when the work is backbreaking. That is the real, enduring legacy of the Anunnaki. Not that they came from the stars to plunder our gold, but that human beings imagined gods powerful enough to create worlds, and then went out and built those worlds themselves. One brick, one canal, 1 ounce of gold at a time. But before we draw our final conclusions, we must examine one more dimension of this mystery: the actual scientific properties of gold itself. Because whether or not the Anunnaki existed, gold is genuinely an extraordinary substance. Understanding why might just shed light on why it has held such a powerful grip on the human imagination for so long. Let's begin with the fundamentals. Gold is element 79 on the periodic table, and its unique atomic structure grants it an extraordinary resistance to corrosion and oxidation. Unlike iron, which rusts away, or copper, which develops a green patina, gold remains eternally unchanged, lustrous, and pure. A gold ring buried for 3,000 years will emerge from the earth looking essentially identical to the day it was forged. This property alone, its sheer permanence, would make gold immensely valuable to any advanced civilization, whether alien or human. If you need a material that will last forever, gold is the unparalleled choice. It's also incredibly malleable and ductile. A single ounce of gold can be hammered into a translucent sheet covering 300 square feet, so thin you can see light through it. A single gram can be drawn into a wire stretching over 2 kilometers long. This means gold can be worked into the most intricate and delicate forms using relatively primitive tools. A Bronze Age craftsman, with enough patience and skill, could create objects of stunning beauty and complexity from gold. No massive furnaces were required for initial shaping, just hammers, a little heat, and time. Furthermore, gold is one of the best conductors of electricity known to science. Our modern electronics are fundamentally reliant on it. Gold is in your smartphone, your computer, and the satellites orbiting our planet. Gold wires carry signals without degrading. Gold contacts resist corrosion and ensure a perfect connection. If you were an advanced civilization building sophisticated technology, gold wouldn't just be useful, it would be indispensable. Sitchin and others have speculated that the Anunnaki needed gold not merely for atmospheric repair but for their technology itself, for spacecraft wiring, computer components, and advanced power systems. There's a clear precedent for this because we use gold in precisely the same ways. NASA famously uses gold foil on spacecraft to reflect infrared radiation and protect sensitive instruments. The magnificent mirror of the James Webb Space Telescope is coated with an ultra-thin layer of gold, chosen specifically for its superior ability to reflect infrared light. So, if aliens did visit Earth seeking raw materials for their advanced technology, gold would absolutely be at the top of their shopping list. But here's the catch. While gold is rare on Earth, it is by no means unique to our planet. Gold is not formed in planetary cores but in the cataclysmic hearts of massive, dying stars during supernova explosions and neutron star collisions. Every single atom of gold in existence was forged in these cosmic catastrophes billions of years ago, then scattered across space to eventually coalesce into new solar systems. This means that any planet that formed from the same cosmic debris as Earth would also contain gold. Mars has gold. The asteroid belt is littered with gold-bearing asteroids. The outer solar system likely contains substantial gold deposits. Think about it. If the Anunnaki possessed the incredible technology required to traverse interstellar space and establish a mining operation on Earth, they certainly would have had the far simpler technology to mine asteroids. And doing so would have been vastly easier. There would be no thick atmosphere to contend with, no crushing gravity well to overcome, and certainly no indigenous population to manage or upgrade. Just fleets of robotic mining drones efficiently extracting pure metal from chunks of rock floating in the void. The fact that they supposedly came all the way to Earth suggests one of two things. Either the entire theory is wrong, or Earth possessed something uniquely valuable. Proponents of the theory argue that this unique resource wasn't the gold itself, but the labor force, the primitive hominids already here, ready to be genetically engineered and put to work. This line of reasoning brings us to another fascinating dimension worth exploring: comparative mythology. The Sumerian creation story is not at all unique in its depiction of humanity being created to serve the gods. The Babylonian epic Enuma Elish, which directly built upon earlier Sumerian traditions, describes the god Marduk creating humans from the blood of a slain god, Kingu, mixed with clay. The explicit purpose? So that humans could bear the gods' burdens, and the gods could be at their leisure. The theme echoes across cultures. An ancient Egyptian text, known as the Instruction of Merakare, describes how the sun god Ra created humans as the cattle of the god, a phrase that is uncomfortably similar to the Anunnaki slave theory. In Greek mythology, Prometheus fashioned humans from clay and water, but when he gifted them the divine fire of knowledge, Zeus was enraged. The punishment for this act of elevation was brutal and eternal. Prometheus was chained to a rock, his liver devoured daily by an eagle, as if sharing knowledge with humanity was the ultimate cosmic crime. In Norse mythology, the first humans, Ask and Embla, were created by the gods Odin, Vili, and Ve from two trees found on a seashore. They were granted life, spirit, and consciousness by the gods, but their existence was predicated on serving and worshipping those same divine beings. In Hindu tradition, humans were created from parts of the cosmic being Purusha during a primordial sacrifice. We are literally made from the body of a divine being. And in the Mayan Popol Vuh, the gods made several attempts to create humanity, systematically destroying earlier versions that failed to properly worship them. The first humans, made of mud, dissolved. The second, made of wood, were mindless and were destroyed by a great flood. Finally, a version crafted from maize proved successful, for these new beings could think, speak, and, most importantly, offer proper worship. What's so striking about these myths is the remarkable consistency of the central theme. Humans are created by divine beings to fulfill a specific purpose, which usually involves working for or worshipping their creators. Why would so many distinct cultures, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, independently develop this same core narrative? The mainstream anthropological answer is that these myths are a reflection of universal human psychology and the social structures of early civilizations. Ancient societies were almost universally hierarchical. Kings ruled over subjects, priests mediated between the heavens and the earth, and the common people labored to support the elite. These creation myths served as a powerful justification for that social order. They sent a clear message. You aren't just working for the pharaoh or the king. You are ultimately working for the gods, and the earthly rulers are merely their intermediaries. This framing made the rigid social hierarchy feel divinely ordained, natural, and unchangeable. But the ancient astronaut theorists see this consistency as powerful evidence for a different conclusion. They argue that all of these cultures were, in fact, describing the same historical event, the same intervention by the same beings, but through their own unique cultural lenses. The gods who created humanity were the Anunnaki, and every culture on Earth retains a fractured, mythologized memory of this origin, even if the names changed and the details became distorted over time. This is a classic expression of the diffusion versus independent invention debate that has raged in anthropology for over a century. Did similar myths arise independently across the globe because humans everywhere confront the same fundamental questions about existence? Or did these stories spread from a single ancient source, carried by migration, trade, or, as the alien theory proposes, by direct instruction from the visitors themselves? The evidence for independent invention is quite strong. Humans everywhere must explain where we come from. We all observe that we must work hard, that we suffer, and that we ultimately die. We all gaze at the sky and wonder if something more powerful exists beyond our limited understanding. Creating myths in which gods fashion humanity to serve them is a perfectly logical narrative response to these universal human experiences. However, the diffusion theory also has merit in certain cases. We have concrete evidence of extensive trade routes and cultural exchange in the ancient world. The Sumerians traded with the Indus Valley Civilization, with Egypt, and with peoples all across the Near East. Ideas travel along trade routes just as surely as goods do. It is entirely plausible that a powerful flood myth originating in Mesopotamia could have spread and been adapted by neighboring cultures. But what about cultures with no known contact? The Mayans and the Mesopotamians had no established interaction. The Aboriginal Australians were isolated for 50,000 years. Yet they, too, have complex creation myths involving ancestral beings shaping both the world and the humans within it. How do we explain the thematic similarities there? The answer might lie in the field of cognitive archaeology, which studies how the universal wiring of the human brain shapes culture. Researchers like Stephen Mithen and Pascal Boyer have argued that certain types of stories are psychologically privileged. They are inherently easier to remember, more emotionally resonant, and thus more likely to be successfully passed down through generations. Creation myths involving powerful, intentional beings who make humans for a specific purpose hit several of these cognitive sweet spots. They answer the big, existential questions. They reinforce social order. They provide a sense of meaning and purpose. And they feature agents with intentions, who did what and why, which is the natural way human brains process and understand causation. We don't instinctively think in terms of impersonal forces. We think in terms of personal agency. Therefore, the independent emergence of similar myths doesn't require alien intervention or a forgotten global civilization. It may only require a universal human psychology. But let's return to gold one last time, because there is an esoteric dimension to its significance that rarely gets discussed in the ancient astronaut debate. For over 2,000 years, alchemists across multiple cultures were obsessed with gold. Their obsession was not just because it was valuable, but because they believed gold held profound metaphysical properties. The alchemical quest to transmute base metals like lead into gold was never merely about getting rich. It was a spiritual pursuit of perfection, transformation, and immortality. Gold represented the incorruptible, eternal substance, the physical manifestation of spiritual enlightenment. An alchemist who could successfully create gold had, in theory, mastered the fundamental principles of both matter and spirit. They had achieved the philosopher's stone, a substance said to not only transmute metals but also grant eternal life. The medieval alchemists were certainly influenced by earlier Egyptian and Greek traditions, which in turn may have drawn upon even older Mesopotamian and Sumerian knowledge. Some researchers have proposed that the cryptic language of alchemy preserves fragments of genuine, advanced ancient science, perhaps knowledge of atomic transmutation or sophisticated metallurgy, encoded in symbolic language to protect it from the uninitiated. If the Anunnaki did exist and eventually departed from Earth, perhaps they left behind carefully chosen individuals who understood fragments of their science. These individuals could have become the first priests, shamans, and alchemists, preserving this sacred knowledge in an obscure, symbolic form until humanity was ready to rediscover it on its own. This is, of course, pure speculation, but it is intriguing speculation. Modern nuclear physics has definitively proven that transmutation is real. We can indeed turn one element into another by manipulating its atomic structure. It just isn't economically feasible to create gold this way. The energy required is vastly more expensive than the gold produced. But the core principle that the alchemists sought, the fundamental mutability of matter, turns out to be true. In a sense, they were right, just working with tools that could never possibly accomplish their goal. Now, let's examine another piece of evidence often raised in ancient astronaut discussions: the Sumerians' advanced knowledge of astronomy. It is an uncontested historical fact that the ancient Mesopotamians were extraordinary astronomers. By the time of the Babylonian Empire, around 1800 to 1600 BCE, they had developed sophisticated mathematical methods for predicting lunar and solar eclipses. They created detailed star catalogs, tracked the movements of the planets with impressive accuracy, and understood the concept of the ecliptic, the path the sun traces across the sky over the course of a year. They divided the sky into constellations, many of which form the basis of the zodiac we still use today. They knew that planetary movements were regular and predictable, governed by discernible mathematical patterns. And they achieved all of this with the naked eye. No telescopes, no modern instruments. Just careful, patient observation carried out over centuries and meticulously recorded on clay tablets. The standard academic explanation for this is straightforward. The Mesopotamians were brilliant observers. They had pressing religious and agricultural needs to track celestial cycles. Knowing when the seasons would change was essential for planting and harvesting crops. Eclipses and other unusual celestial events were considered powerful omens, direct signs from the gods, so tracking and predicting them was a primary priestly duty. Over many generations of diligent observation, they accumulated a vast and genuine body of astronomical knowledge. But here is the claim often made by ancient astronaut theorists. The Sumerians knew about planets they shouldn't have been able to see, specifically Uranus and Neptune, which are invisible to the naked eye and weren't discovered by modern astronomy until the 18th and 19th centuries, respectively. The primary evidence for this claim usually comes back to that same cylinder seal, VA 243, which Zecharia Sitchin famously claimed depicts our sun surrounded by 12 celestial bodies, including these hidden outer planets. As we've discussed, this interpretation is roundly rejected by mainstream scholars, who identify the central symbol as a prominent star, not the sun, and the surrounding objects as either other stars or symbolic representations, not a literal diagram of our solar system. Let's look deeper at what the Sumerians and Babylonians actually wrote in their own astronomical texts. The detailed records that survive, like the Appen tablets, list exactly which planets they observed. They saw Venus, which they called Dilbat, Jupiter, Mulababur, Mars, Salbatanu, Saturn, Kyamanu, and Mercury, Gudud, plus the sun and the moon. That's a total of 7 celestial bodies, not 12. There is absolutely no reference in any authentic Sumerian or Babylonian astronomical text to planets beyond Saturn. None. This is precisely why scholars are so dismissive of Sitchin's 12th planet claim. It simply is not found in the source material. But here's where it gets genuinely interesting. The Babylonians clearly noticed that while the background stars were fixed, certain bright objects wandered across the sky. In fact, that's what the word planet means in Greek: wanderer. They understood that these planets were fundamentally different from stars. They tracked their movements with impressive precision and even began to grasp that these movements could be described mathematically. By the late Babylonian period, around 400 to 300 BCE, they were using sophisticated geometric models to predict future planetary positions. This level of astronomical sophistication is both genuine and astonishing, but it does not require alien instruction. It requires curiosity, intelligence, and time, a tremendous amount of time. If you watch the night sky carefully for decades, patterns emerge. If you write those patterns down and compare observations across generations, you can develop powerful predictive models. That is the very essence of science, human science. It is not knowledge gifted from the stars, but knowledge discovered through tireless human effort. There's also the question of the Sumerian king list, which we touched on earlier but deserves a deeper examination. This remarkable document, which exists in multiple versions on various clay tablets and prisms, lists the kings of Sumer in sequence, along with the lengths of their reigns. The list is starkly divided into 2 eras: pre-flood and post-flood rulers. The pre-flood kings, often called the antediluvian kings, are listed with reigns lasting for tens of thousands of years. For instance, Alulim of Eridu is said to have ruled for 28,800 years, and Alanger for 36,000 years. The list records 8 kings in 5 cities ruling for a combined, staggering total of 241,200 years before the Great Flood swept over the land. Then, the tablet records the flood comes, and kingship descended from heaven again to a new city, Kish. The post-flood kings have much shorter reigns, though they are still implausibly long by modern standards. The first king of Kish is listed as ruling for 1,200 years. As the list continues chronologically forward toward historical times, the reign lengths gradually decrease until we reach well-known figures like Gilgamesh, who is listed with a reign of 126 years, still superhuman, but within the realm of legendary exaggeration rather than absurd impossibility. Mainstream historians interpret the antediluvian kings as entirely mythological. The impossibly long reigns are not meant to be taken literally. They are symbolic, representing an idealized, distant past. A golden age when semi-divine rulers governed the land. The gradual shortening of reigns as the list approaches historical times represents the transition from pure myth to legend, and finally to actual history. It's the ancient world's way of saying, this is how things were in the mythical time of origins, versus this is how things were within recent memory. But Sitchin saw something else entirely. He proposed that the key lies in the Sumerian base 60 sexagesimal counting system. The Sumerians had a numerical unit called a shar, which represented the number 3,600. Sitchin argued that the antediluvian reign lengths were not recorded in Earth years but in shars. If you divide Alulim's reign of 28,800 years by 3,600, you get exactly 8. Sitchin's conclusion: if a king ruled for 8 shars, and each shar represented one orbit of the planet Nibiru, then that king ruled for 28,800 Earth years but only 8 Nibiruan years. Suddenly, the numbers become far more plausible, if you happen to be an immortal or extremely long-lived alien. This is a creative piece of mathematics, but it suffers from major problems. First, there is no textual evidence whatsoever that the SAR was used this way. It certainly appears in Sumerian texts as a numerical unit, but it's used for counting large quantities of goods or describing architectural measurements. It is never explicitly defined as one Nibiruan orbital period. Sitchin made that connection himself. Second, if this system were consistently applied, why would the post-flood kings be listed with completely different reign lengths that don't fit the pattern? If the first king after the flood ruled for 1,200 years, that's only 1/3 of a shar. Does that mean he ruled for a mere third of a Nibiruan year? The logic breaks down. The simpler, more direct explanation is that the list is not recording literal reign lengths at all. It is a political and religious document, designed to establish the immense antiquity and divine authority of Sumerian kingship. The further back in time you go, the more mythological the narrative becomes, and mythology does not concern itself with realistic timescales. Nevertheless, the king list remains one of the most fascinating documents from ancient Mesopotamia precisely because it does contain real historical information. Names that appear toward the end of the list, from around 2600 BCE onward, can be cross-referenced with other archaeological evidence. Gilgamesh, for example, though a legendary figure, was almost certainly a real historical king of Uruk. Archaeological excavations have confirmed the existence of many of the cities named in the king list, and its structure, recording dynasty after dynasty in sequence, provides an invaluable framework for understanding the political history of early Mesopotamia. It is simultaneously myth and history, which is exactly what makes it such a rich and complicated document. Let's now turn to a question that rarely gets asked in these debates. If the Anunnaki created us to mine gold and then departed, why exactly did they leave? Sitchin's proposed timeline suggests the Anunnaki were on Earth for over 400,000 years. That is an almost incomprehensible span of time. For context, modern Homo sapiens have only existed for about 300,000 years. Recorded human civilization is only about 6,000 years old. The entire span from the first cities to the age of smartphones is less than 2% of the time the Anunnaki supposedly spent here. So what changed? Why would they abandon such a long-term, massive investment? One theory within the ancient astronaut framework is that they simply got what they needed. After 400,000 years of mining, they had extracted a sufficient quantity of gold to stabilize Nibiru's atmosphere. Mission accomplished. They packed up and left, leaving their human creations behind to fend for themselves. Another popular theory is that internal conflicts among the Anunnaki themselves forced a withdrawal. Sitchin wrote extensively about a war between two factions, one led by Enlil and the other by his half-brother Enki, with humanity caught in the middle. Perhaps this conflict escalated to a point where maintaining their presence on Earth was no longer viable. Or perhaps they didn't leave entirely. Maybe they simply went into hiding, withdrawing from direct control but maintaining constant surveillance, observing how their grand experiment evolved. This idea ties into broader conspiracy theories about secret cabals, elite bloodlines, and hidden knowledge, suggesting the Anunnaki could still be manipulating human events from behind the scenes, working through chosen human intermediaries who are kept in positions of power generation after generation. The problem with all these theories is that they are fundamentally unfalsifiable. Any absence of evidence is conveniently explained away as evidence of a cover-up or proof of successful concealment. This is intellectually unsatisfying because it means no discovery, no matter how contradictory, could ever disprove the theory. If we find evidence, it proves the Anunnaki existed. If we don't find evidence, it proves they expertly hid their tracks. This is the hallmark of pseudoscience. a concept brilliantly articulated by the philosopher Karl Popper. A genuine scientific theory must be falsifiable. There must be some conceivable observation that would prove it wrong. Most ancient astronaut theories generally fail this critical test. But let's consider the alternative. What if we approached the Sumerian texts not as coded alien messages, but as what they were clearly intended to be: religious literature, theological explanations, political propaganda, and creation myths? If we do that, they become no less fascinating. In fact, they become more fascinating because we can ask what they reveal about the people who wrote them. The Atrahasis epic, for example, reveals a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of environmental relationships. The gods create humans to perform agricultural labor, digging canals and maintaining irrigation systems. But when the human population multiplies too quickly, they disrupt the cosmic balance, becoming too noisy and consuming too many resources. The gods respond with a series of population control measures: plague, famine, and ultimately a great flood. This isn't a history of alien intervention. This is Bronze Age Mesopotamian society grappling with concerns about overpopulation, resource management, and the delicate relationship between humanity and the environment, issues that are still profoundly relevant today. The fact that they framed these concerns in theological language doesn't make them any less real or less important. Similarly, the famous flood narrative in Atrahasis and other Mesopotamian texts reflects a genuine, lived experience with catastrophic flooding. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers flooded regularly, sometimes with devastating consequences. To live in Mesopotamia was to live with the constant awareness that water, the source of all life, could also be the source of total destruction. A massive flood that destroyed cities and killed thousands would have been seared into cultural memory and inevitably mythologized. The fact that flood myths appear in cultures worldwide doesn't require a single, global flood or alien intervention. It simply requires that human civilizations tend to build their cities near major water sources, all of which are prone to flooding. All it requires is for humans to live near water, a common practice for most civilizations, as water is the lifeblood of agriculture and trade. When we read these myths not as alien logs but as human documents, artifacts born from human anxieties and the boundless human imagination, we don't diminish them in the slightest. On the contrary, we enrich them. It shows us how people, for millennia ago, grappled with the very same fundamental questions that haunt us today. Why is life so difficult? Why must we labor? Why do terrible things happen to good people? What is our ultimate purpose? The Mesopotamian answer was theological in nature. We work, they reasoned, because the gods created us specifically for that purpose. Bad things happen because the gods are powerful and capricious. Our purpose is to serve the divine will. While this may not be an answer most modern people would find satisfying, it represents an honest and profound attempt to make sense of existence using the conceptual tools they had at their disposal. Now, to be absolutely fair to the ancient astronaut theorists, the archaeological record is not without its legitimate mysteries. Take Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey. Dated to around 9600 BC, it is a massive, sophisticated stone temple complex built by a people who, according to all previous models of human history, shouldn't have been capable of such a feat. These were supposedly nomadic hunter-gatherers, not a settled agricultural society with the resources and organization for monumental architecture. Building Göbekli Tepe would have required organizing vast numbers of workers, establishing supply lines to feed them, coordinating the quarrying and transportation of massive stone pillars, and carving intricate, symbolic reliefs. This level of social organization simply wasn't supposed to exist 11,600 years ago. The discovery has forced archaeologists to completely reconsider the timeline of human social development. Perhaps complex societies could emerge before the advent of agriculture, not after. Maybe the relationship between settlement farming and monumental architecture is far more complicated than we ever thought. This discovery doesn't mean aliens built Göbekli Tepe. It means that our own ancestors were far more capable, innovative, and surprising than we have often given them credit for. And then there is the intriguing fact that gold's true cosmic origin story is, in itself, utterly extraordinary. Even without the intervention of aliens, the science tells us that every single atom of gold in your jewelry, in your electronics, and within the Earth's crust was forged in the death throes of colossal stars or in the cataclysmic collisions of neutron stars. These are events of unimaginable violence, releasing more energy in a matter of seconds than our sun will produce in its entire 10 billion-year lifetime. Gold is, quite literally, stardust, the scattered remnants of stellar catastrophes that seeded the cosmos. When you hold a piece of gold, you are holding a fragment of the universe's most dramatic history. That is already a miracle. We don't need to add aliens to make it meaningful. The ancient Mesopotamians didn't know about supernovae or nuclear fusion in stellar cores, but they intuitively recognized that gold was special. They called it the flesh of the gods, The incorruptible metal, the one substance that could bridge the gap between earth and heaven. In a way, they weren't wrong. Gold is a bridge, just not between our world and alien visitors. It is a bridge between the birth of our solar system and the death of the stars that came long before it. It connects us to deep time, to cosmic processes, and to the fundamental forces that shape the very fabric of the universe. That is what gold truly signifies. Not slavery, not extraterrestrial mining operations, but our tangible, material connection to the cosmos itself. As we approach the end of this journey, a journey through clay tablets and ancient astronaut theories, through academic debates and the properties of minerals, through mythology and metallurgy, we are left with a more profound question. The question is not whether the Anunnaki were real, but what our willingness to believe in them says about us, about the contours of human nature, and about our complex relationship with mystery and the search for meaning. The ancient astronaut theory emerged and flourished during a very particular cultural moment. The 1960s and 70s, when authors like Erich von Däniken and Zecharia Sitchin were publishing their seminal books, was an era of unprecedented space exploration, rampant UFO sightings, consciousness expansion, and a deep-seated questioning of established authorities. The moon landing in 1969 proved that space travel was a reality. The thinking went, if we could visit the moon, why couldn't someone else have visited Earth? At the same time, the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal had severely eroded public trust in governments and institutions. If they would lie about that, what else were they hiding? The counterculture was actively exploring altered states of consciousness, Eastern mysticism, and alternative ways of knowing. To many, traditional Western scientific rationalism felt cold and limiting. Perhaps there were profound truths the establishment couldn't or wouldn't see. Into this fertile cultural moment came theories that satisfied multiple needs at once. They were cloaked in the language of science, invoking genetics, astronomy, and archaeology, which lent them an air of modern credibility. Yet they were also deeply mystical, speaking of ancient wisdom, hidden knowledge, and cosmic connections, which appealed to a deeper spiritual hunger. They offered a direct challenge to mainstream authority, positioning believers as enlightened truth-seekers, which felt empowering and politically radical. And, perhaps most importantly, they provided simple, dramatic answers to the most complex questions about human origins and purpose, which felt psychologically comforting. The fact that academic experts universally rejected these theories didn't weaken them. In the eyes of believers, it strengthened them. The rejection itself could be interpreted as proof that the experts were either blind to the truth or, more tantalizingly, complicit in a massive cover-up. This dynamic hasn't changed in the decades since. If anything, it has intensified in the internet age, where anyone can find a self-affirming community of like-minded believers, where alternative theories spread faster than expert rebuttals, and where the line between entertainment and education has become increasingly blurred. The rise of the History Channel's Ancient Aliens series, which premiered in 2009 and ran for many years, brought these theories to a massive new audience. The show's signature format, presenting fringe ideas alongside mainstream archaeology without clearly distinguishing between them, created the false impression that these were credible and widely accepted alternative viewpoints. The show's famous tagline, "Is it possible that?" became a cultural meme, because technically, almost anything is possible. Is it possible that aliens visited Earth in antiquity? Sure, it's possible. Is it likely? No. Is there any credible evidence? Absolutely not. But the show treated possible as if it meant plausible, and an entire generation of viewers absorbed ancient astronaut theories as if they were legitimate historical interpretations rather than fringe speculation rejected by every single relevant academic discipline. This matters because belief in ancient astronauts isn't just harmless intellectual speculation. It has real-world consequences. First, it diminishes human achievement by attributing our ancestors' greatest accomplishments to alien intervention. When you look at the Great Pyramids and your immediate thought is, aliens must have built them, you are implicitly saying that the ancient Egyptians couldn't possibly have been intelligent, organized, or capable enough to build them on their own. This isn't just factually wrong. It's a form of cultural dismissal that often carries troubling, racist undertones, especially when these theories are selectively applied to non-European civilizations, the Egyptians, the Maya, the builders of Angkor Wat, but rarely to the monuments of the Greeks or Romans. It also promotes scientific illiteracy. It teaches people to distrust expert consensus and to believe that academic credentials and the peer review process are tools of suppression rather than the best methods we have for determining truth. Once you believe that all the world's archaeologists are lying about the Anunnaki, it becomes much easier to believe that climate scientists are lying about global warming, or that medical scientists are lying about vaccines. The entire epistemology behind ancient astronaut theories, the way they determine what is true, is fundamentally flawed and encourages people to make decisions based on what feels right rather than what the evidence actually supports. Finally, it distracts from the genuinely fascinating questions and discoveries of real archaeology. When you're convinced that Sumerian tablets are describing alien visitors, you aren't engaging with what those tablets actually say about Bronze Age Mesopotamian religion, politics, society, and their intricate worldview. You are missing the real, complex human story in favor of a much simpler, fictional alien one. But here is the question truly worth considering. Why do we need the story to be about aliens? What is it about the genuine human story that feels so inadequate? Perhaps it's because the real story of human history is profoundly uncomfortable. We evolved through random mutation and natural selection, processes that are mindless, aimless, and utterly uncaring. There was no grand design, no inherent purpose, just the survival of whichever organisms happened to reproduce successfully. We built our civilizations not through revealed wisdom from the heavens, but through painstaking trial and error, through immense suffering and gradual innovation over thousands of years. Countless people died. Countless experiments failed. Progress was slow, uneven, and often reversed by catastrophe. We fought endless, brutal wars over resources, territory, and ideas. We enslaved one another. We ravaged our environment. We created works of extraordinary beauty and committed acts of terrible cruelty, often in the very same breath. This is the real human story, and it is morally ambiguous, messy, and unglamorous. It lacks a clear, pre-written purpose or meaning. We are forced to make our own meaning as we go, and we often disagree violently about what that meaning should be. The ancient astronaut theory offers a seductive alternative. It says there is a design, there is a purpose. We were created, which means we matter. Our history, while manipulated, follows a coherent pattern. The aliens will one day return, which means there's a future event to anticipate, a potential rescue or a final reckoning. It transforms human history from a chaotic, seemingly purposeless accident into a grand narrative with a clear beginning, a middle, and a pending conclusion. That is a deeply, powerfully appealing idea. And maybe we need to sit with that appeal for a moment, to ask ourselves what it would mean to accept the genuine human story, with all its chaos and ambiguity, and find meaning and purpose within it anyway. Not because it was designed for us, but because we, ourselves, choose to create meaning from it. The gold theory, the ancient astronaut narrative, the idea that we were engineered as a slave species, it all offers a kind of twisted comfort. It tells you that you're struggling because you were designed to struggle. You're working so hard because that's what you were made for. It absolves us of ultimate responsibility while simultaneously explaining away our suffering. But the true story, while harder to accept, is infinitely more inspiring. We struggle because life itself is difficult. We work because survival requires immense effort. We build because we dream of something better. We mine gold because we, as humans, decided it was valuable, and that collective decision has shaped the course of history. We are not the slaves of absent gods. We are the descendants of people who looked out at a hostile, indifferent world and decided to transform it. People who saw chaos and imposed order. People who faced the vast unknown and responded not with fear, but with boundless curiosity. That is the human story, and it is more than enough. No aliens required. As you drift off to sleep tonight, let these images gently fade. Picture the clay tablets, crumbling back into dust. See the elaborate theories dissolving like mist in the morning sun. Allow the great question of our origin to settle back into a comfortable, wondrous mystery. The truth is, we may never know every detail of how our ancestors built their first cities, why they cherished gold, or what they truly believed about the gods they worshipped. But we know enough. We know they were human, fully and completely human, clever and foolish, inspired and superstitious, capable of incredible acts of creation and terrible acts of cruelty. Just like us. The Anunnaki, whether they were gods or aliens, metaphors or memories, are silent now. But the echo of their story continues to reverberate in every gold ring, in every archaeological dig, in every single person who looks up at the star-filled sky and wonders. Who made us, and why are we here? The answer might be simpler and yet more profound than we ever imagined. We made ourselves. Through millions of years of evolution, thousands of years of cultural development, and the countless individual choices made by countless individual human beings. We made ourselves, and we are still in the process of making ourselves. Still digging, still building, still reaching for something just beyond our grasp. Whether that something is gold, knowledge, meaning, or the stars themselves. Sleep well. Dream of ancient cities and distant worlds. And when you wake, remember this: you are not the creation of absent gods. You are the heir to every human who has ever come before you. Every person who struggled and loved and built and dreamed. That inheritance is worth more than all the gold on earth.